How does consciousness emerge? Where does it come from?
Consciousness?
We have this movie playing in our minds, right? We have this subjective experience, but we don't know how this happens to exist.
It seems like the brain is somehow creating this.
It seems so, but it's a little more complicated. No matter how much we dissect and study the brain neurons, we can't know how consciousness emerges from it. Brain is just a physical object made of particles. How could a group of particles create this subjective, conscious experience?
Maybe we have some kind of a soul attached to our physical brain.
Maybe, no one knows. But I will try to stay away from explaining this by souls. For today, let's try to think about this. How consciousness emerges. Here is an interesting thought experiment. The China brain. Suppose there are billions of Chinese people. Give all of them a cell phone. Now we will make them communicate with each other in a certain way.
Certain way?
In a way that simulates a brain. Each of them will represent a single neuron. In a brain, neurons communicate with each other. That's how a brain processes information. Just like the neurons, each Chinese will communicate to each other with cell phones. They do so exactly like neurons in a brain.
So basically, the whole country of China is simulating a brain.
Yes. Now the question is this. Would China be conscious?
Oh, I see.
Their communication through cell phone is exactly the same pattern as neurons communicating.
But it's not a real brain. How could talking on cell phone be conscious? It doesn't seem right.
Really? Brain also is just neurons communicating with each other. If we exchange neurons with humans, what difference would it make?
Still, it doesn't sound right.
Okay, then what about the brain do you think brings consciousness to existence?
Well, neurons?
A neuron is just a cell made of particles. Why would it be so special?
I don't know.
What your consciousness is experiencing are the sensations of your body and your senses like sight and vision. These are what your brain or neurons are processing. You are experiencing the information your neurons are processing.
That's true.
Don't you think it's more reasonable to say that consciousness emerged from the information processing of your neurons instead of neurons themselves? I mean, neurons themselves are constantly dying and being born. Atoms that make up each neurons are constantly changing. What neurons are forming is a pattern, an information processing pattern.
I guess you could say that.
Now, if consciousness emerges from information processing pattern, does it have to be neurons? I think this is the question this China brain thought experiment is addressing.
I see. If Chinese create the same pattern, China may have a consciousness. I'm not sure if it's true, but it's an interesting idea. If you can say that, then a computer simulation of brain may have consciousness too.
Yes, I think you could say that. Let's expand on this idea. If we suppose that consciousness emerges from information processing patterns, what is the boundary? For what pattern does consciousness emerge and for what pattern not emerge?
Maybe the neurological pattern of a human brain is the key.
So if we tweak it a little, would consciousness disappear? How about animal brains? They're similar to humans.
Well, I'd like to believe that animals are conscious beings as well.
If so, what about simpler brains like insects? How do you draw a boundary?
I guess insects have consciousness, just not as colorful and complicated as humans.
Do you see? It's hard to draw a strict line where consciousness suddenly appears or disappears. It's more likely it's a gradient than a sharp boundary. But this idea can take us to a very strange hypothesis. Maybe any pattern has some sort of consciousness.
Any pattern?
If we can't draw a sharp boundary, even the smallest pattern could have a subtle consciousness. Maybe an atom has some sort of consciousness. Maybe the ecosystem of Amazon rainforest has a consciousness. Maybe a group of people has a consciousness, just like the China brain.
It doesn't really seem right.
We can have consciousness over interaction of neurons, which are just one type of physical object. Why not from interaction of other stuff?
I get your logic, but it's a very strange idea.
Another theory has a simpler idea. Maybe everything is somewhat conscious. This theory is called Panpsychism. There are variations to this theory, but the main idea is this. Consciousness is fundamental and everywhere.
Everything? Even an electron?
Yes.
Are you saying that an electron can think?
No, not saying they can think. The theory says that it is experiencing something. Although the experience wouldn't be anything as complicated as humans experience.
So it has consciousness, but it's not complicated enough for it to think.
These basic, simple consciousness can come together to create a bigger, more complex consciousness. Compared to assuming that consciousness suddenly emerges from mindless particles arranged in a specific way, it's more natural to assume that the building blocks have some aspect of consciousness in the first place. At least that's the idea.
Maybe that's so. But where does consciousness of the electron come from then?
The idea is that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of nature, just like matter. We don't know where matter comes from, but we accept it as fundamental, right?
Oh, I see. That way they can avoid the question.
You could say that, but we do the same for matter, time, space, and so on.
I have a question. Your brain is still processing information when you're asleep. If everything is conscious, how can you go to sleep or be unconscious?
That's like saying if everything is physical, how can a house stop to exist? Consciousnesses always emerge and break down.
So are we dead every night?
Some people think so. Others argue that you are never really unconscious. When you sleep, your consciousness becomes less complex and you don't remember them. Of course, there are many arguments against panpsychism. You can't test it in experiments. But still, I think it's an interesting idea. Earlier, I said information processing pattern might give rise to consciousness. Instead of saying everything is conscious, other theories try to explain what kind of pattern creates consciousness in more details. One is called integrated information theory. It's complicated, but let me try to briefly explain it in simple terms. The key idea is this. First, by observing our own consciousness, we can identify the characteristics of consciousness. Then, the information processing patterns that correspond to the characteristics can be identified in the brain.
Do you have an example?
For example, one characteristic is integration. Various sensations are integrated to form a single experience. That's how you experience stuff, right?
Yes, I get it.
To achieve this integration, information have to be unified and interdependent. So, we can take a system and say how much integrated the processed information is.
I see.
Likewise, once they identify the necessary information processing pattern for a consciousness to emerge, they can mathematically calculate the level of consciousness of a system. They gave a name to this calculated level of consciousness as phi.
So they can mathematically identify what is how much conscious? Wow.
For example, they can tell our cerebral cortex, a part of a brain, is conscious. However, another part called cerebellum is not very conscious, even though there are much more neurons there. That's because the information processed there is not interconnected enough, which does not fit with the identified pattern.
So, did they find any other things that have consciousness?
Not really. The theory does accept that systems other than brain could have consciousness, but it hasn't identified a real specific example with high level of phi yet, as far as I know. So, these were some interesting theories about consciousness. The mystery of consciousness is something that has bothered humans for a long time. So there are many interesting thought experiments and theories like these.
But you can't test these theories, right?
Sadly, we can't.
I hope someday we can discover the truth.
Thank you for watching.